Hello, welcome to The Origin of Things, or TOOT for short. A short format podcast where I give you the origins, the backstories, slightly dramatized but 100% true, of things that you know, love and use. I reveal what I'm talking about only at the very end, keeping you, the listener, guessing. Or so I hope. In the first 2 seasons, I've taken you through the stories that have led to some of your favorite brands and the unlikely stories and accidents that got us there. If there's a lesson from this podcast, let it be that great things can come from the most unexpected of places and even some mistakes. This season, however, I'm doing something different and focusing on music. The stories behind some of the most iconic songs that have ever existed. I am your host, Deepak Gopalakrishnan, or as the world calls me, Chuck. The origins of that for another day. Let's move on to today's story. The reclusive, eccentric scientist Oscar Collins has 2 next-door neighbors, a pop photographer and his girlfriend/model, Penny. Discovering a beam of light streaming through a hole in the wall between them, Collins follows the light and spots Penny modeling for a photo shoot. He begins to make more holes as the days go by and becomes a peeping Tom as they do more photo sessions. Oscar gradually becomes infatuated with the girl and feels a part of the couple's lives, even forsaking work to observe them. When they quarrel and the couple splits, Penny takes an overdose of pills and passes out, but Oscar comes to her rescue. That's the plot to a 1968 British psychedelic film. The name of the movie, well, we'll get into that in a bit. Not much is known about the commercial success or otherwise of the movie. It does have an 80% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a more middle-of-the-road 5.6 on IMDb. Professional retrospective reviews too are mixed. It's been called by one publication as, quote, required viewing for anyone interested in the popular culture of the 1960s, while another publication was far less charitable, calling it, and I quote, self-indulgent whimsy, with not a great deal to be self-indulgent about. The movie is streaming on Amazon Prime Video should you be interested to draw your own conclusion. Right, so a largely unremarkable movie. Perhaps the most remarkable part of it, however, was its music. And here is where this podcast's interest with it comes in. It's one of the most influential soundtracks of all time. Those above retrospective reviews, even if critical, do give a nod to the music. This could be because the director, a first-time director, gave the music team absolute carte blanche to do what they liked. One of the reasons that the music became so entrenched could be that it was fairly, Indian in nature. Remember, this was the mid-60s in Britain. It was a fairly psychedelic time. Of course, the Beatles were the biggest importers of Indian musical sensibilities into popular culture, but others were there too. And while the Beatles did incorporate Indian elements into their music on songs such as Norwegian Wood, Within You Without You, and Across the Universe, they were never explicitly a Indian rock music band. The movie's music, on the other hand, was more explicit. Why? Sample some song names. Tabla and Pakavaj, Guru Vandana, Gat Kirwani. In fact, part of the music was even recorded at the EMI studios in Bombay, now Mumbai of course, in 1968. The album featured work by notable Indian classical musicians like Ashish Khan on sarod, Mahapurush Mishra on tabla, Shambhu Das, a frequent collaborator with Ravi Shankar, on sitar, Shankar Ghosh on tabla, the playing of which won him a Sangeet Natak Academy Award, Pandit Shiv Kumar Sharma on santoor, and many, many more. The soundtrack received mixed reviews on release, but as with such path-breaking art, its legacy was to be felt only much later. Let me quote from its Wikipedia page. John Dale says its true historical significance lies in its standing as one of the first records to really bring Indian classical music into pop and rock across the entire narrative of an album. Shambhu Das, who played on the album, recognizes the album as having helped inspire Indo-jazz fusion. American film score composer Quincy Jones once described it as the greatest soundtrack he had heard. End Wikipedia quote. And there are many other such assessments too. A pioneer in fusing global music, an early example of what would eventually become known as world music, groundbreaking blend of Bombay and London. And yes, while many got inspired by this so-called raga rock, the album also had its influence on bands that had nothing to do with Indian music at all. One such band was not too far away from where the Beatles were from. The primary songwriter wrote a song called Wishing Stone for his then girlfriend. Finally, he decided to change the name of the song for reasons unknown. Maybe it was because Wishing Stone was just a working title, or maybe it was because the new song title just fell better to sing, or maybe it was because the songwriter wanted to pay tribute to that seminal soundtrack I've been talking about all this while. Because it's been theorized time and again what the name actually means, and nobody really has a clue. Perhaps for the true meaning, we need to ask the person who first came up with the word. Joe Massett, the director of that psychedelic movie. The movie whose name was given to the soundtrack, which ended up becoming the de facto debut album by one of the most famous names in music, George Harrison of the Beatles. Yes, he was the composer. He was the one who traveled to Bombay in 1968 and collaborated with all those Indian musicians while staying at the Taj Hotel in the evenings making notes. The name of this album would then be used as the title for the biggest hit, if far from the best song, recorded by a young band from Manchester. A young band that had just tasted success and who were probably very much on their ascent to being one of the biggest bands in the world. Probably the last really huge band the world has seen, at least at the time of recording this podcast. A band called Oasis. A band whose biggest hit has nothing to do with Indian music at all, but somehow has an unlikely connect to it. A song whose name initially was the name of that 1968 British psychedelic movie, and then George Harrison's debut album. A song called Wonderwall. See you next week with another episode from The Origin of Things. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us and all our shows on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcast.com. You can also follow us on social media. We are at IVM Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to reach out to me, that's Chuck_Gopal on Twitter and Chuck of All Trades on Instagram. All links in the show notes of this episode. See you next week.